Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill. I am your host, Ramsey Nasser. From the rise of mobile phones to social media and now artificial intelligence, over the past 2 decades, we have seen how the digital world has steadily invaded all facets of contemporary life, and even religion and spiritual practices have not been spared. But how exactly is modern technology transforming spiritual practices? A brand new edited volume published by Gruyter Brill seeks to answer that question exactly. Using various interdisciplinary projects and approaches, the authors demonstrate that digitalization doesn't dissolve religion per se, but instead fosters dynamic new forms of interaction across social media, mobile applications, and all the rest of the virtual public sphere. Key studies in the volume investigate everything from online mourning rituals to the rise of religious influencers and even the integration of artificial intelligence in theological discourse. The book is called Religious Communication, Interaction, and Transformation in a Culture of Digitality. And to tell us more about it, we are delighted to be joined by its 2 editors, Dr. Thomas Schlag and Katerina Yadav. Dr. Thomas Schlag is Professor of Practical Theology at the Faculty of Theology and the Study of Religion at the University of Zurich. And he is also Director and Co-Principal Investigator in the University Research Priority Program Project P9 Interreligious Education in the Digital Society. Katerina Yadav is a doctoral student of practical theology at the same faculty, and she is also scientific assistant to the director of that same university research priority program. Dr. Schlag and Ms. Yadav, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
It's so great to have you. To begin with some background, I suppose, the book emerged out of a university research priority program called Digital Religions, with the S there in a bracket, Communication, Interaction, and Transformation in the Digital Society, which was established at the University of Zurich in 2021. Could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we are positioned at the University of Zurich, and as you already mentioned, we are part of a funding scheme of the University of Zurich called University Research Priority Programs. And in our case, we have been funded from 2021 on very significantly, and we were very happy because this funding scheme is very competitive all over the university. So we've been competing with medicine, with physics, with neuroscience, with all kinds of life sciences. And as mainly being a project from the humanities, we were really happy that the university said at the time, this is a very, very convincing and promising submission. So we were successful, and they decided to give us a funding, not only significantly in terms of money. We're talking about 25 million francs over, but also in terms of the length of the funding, which is 12 years. So that gives us a lot of time and opportunities to also adjust to all the, developments and the challenges that you already kind of raised as an issue regarding the influence of technology, of AI on religion, religious practices. So we're quite happy that the university saw this as a promising program for the whole of the university, also in its interdisciplinary sense. And so that's where we are.
I would like to jump in, say a few words about digital religions research in general, because I think the university saw that most of digital religions research at that time, when the URPP started, was in English-speaking countries and also in the English language. So there was a big gap, and because of the growth of digital religions research, the need was increasingly highlighted for scholars from non-English speaking countries to take part in the discourses, such as from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and to engage more actively in that research. And what I found very interesting, what I would just like to tell our audience, that digital religions research emerged from the 1990s onwards. So it was not a new thing exactly. This is actually like the first moment when internet entered private households. but it shows that how broad the field already was. And of course, it became even more important over the past 2 decades with the rise of digital research methods, online platforms, and social media. So that's why we are researching in that field.
Yeah, maybe also to add a quite interesting coincidence, which made it probably also very plausible for us to get funded. We started with the application about a year or so before COVID came. As Katharina already said, although there had been research on religion and digitalization, it was more or less an exotic issue in the academic field. And then when Corona or COVID came, all of a sudden people saw not only the need, but also the real practice of religion during these times, which then actually made our application very plausible in the sense, okay, something is going on and research needs to be done on that. So there was this kind of coincidence, sad for many, but in this case, quite positively for us.
Got it. So it's born in the 90s, but actually really began to flourish tremendously after the COVID experience. Your volume uses this, I mentioned it earlier, that S at the end of digital religions with the S in brackets. It's a bit of an unusual designation. What does that umbrella term signify for you about the diversity of religious practices you encountered? Why did you opt to put it in brackets? Why not digital religions?
Well, I'm very happy to answer to this really interesting question that people keep asking. The term digital religions with the plural S placed in parentheses functions as an umbrella concept, as you are saying, for our research at the URPP. And on the one hand, the plural signals that the term religions brings together phenomena and practices from very different religious backgrounds. On the other hand, these phenomena are grouped under a common heading by adding the S in brackets. So at this point, I feel that maybe for our audience, it would be helpful to get a definition of religion. And we as a URPP never committed to a single fixed definition of the term. But I feel that one definition is particularly helpful in my work, which is by the German theologian Wilhelm Greb. He understands religion as a form of human self-interpretation. This means that religion is mainly a human affair that becomes visible in lived experiences, interpretations, and orientations. And this approach actually shifts the focus away from institutionalized religion towards the individual, which we can see in digital spaces. Religion becomes a kind of meaning-making. It happens more in between the lines, which can be found everywhere on social media. It's not about concrete religious questions and scriptural interpretations or established religious topoi, but religion is more expressed through narratives, metaphors, and the language people actually use. And that's why we found it to be a helpful concept. Now, addressing the plural again, the authors in our volume emphasize that the field of digital religion research is inherently diverse. For instance, one project focuses on Muslim communities, which is chapter 6, and another one examines interreligious dynamics and educational settings, which is chapter 9. This commitment to religious plurality is further strengthened in the second phase of the URPP, though. So this will be something we are working on even more now. For example, the project on monastic organizations, which is chapter 4, has been expanded to include Buddhist and Hindu communities. And a new focus has been placed on neo-religious or so-called spiritual influences. So we're still getting there to the religions. I would just like to add, ultimately, the term digital religions with a parenthetical S is intended to capture this multi-layered complexity of a shared overarching field, which is at the same time composed of all these diverse narratives, meaning-making practices, and strategies.
There is also another, maybe more, formal reason why we chose this term when we applied for the whole project. And that was that we already had this digital religion research over, as it was explained, over the last, 30 years or so. But we wanted to also make a difference by going into that direction. And so we used the S in parentheses also to signal that we go beyond the digital religion research in a sense. Saying we do not only continue or in a sense just do what has been done before, but we want to be more creative. And apart from that, it is also important nowadays, which is interesting for me as being a theologian, that when you nowadays do research on religion, you always have to have in mind the plurality of religions. Even in a rather homogeneous context like it is in Switzerland or in the German-speaking countries, that nowadays you can just not, and you must not only refer to Christian traditions. So that was also two more reasons why we chose this term. Yeah, I think the university board, they got the message, and seeing that right from the start on, we were open to also go into directions of religiosity beyond the institutional, beyond the Christian traditions. Yeah, and I would even say that due to our program, the term digital religions itself has somehow been established now in the academic community due to our research.
Absolutely brilliant, very clear, and fully answers the question. There's another term that also comes up quite regularly in the book, quote, the culture of digitality, end quote, which was defined by someone named Felix Stadler. You know, we have a bit of a generalist audience here, people who are broadly interested in the humanities and beyond, or who are specialists in a particular field, but take an interdisciplinary approach to their work. Could you help explain this concept to our more generalist audience? As I understand it, this framing looks at the digital not so much as a separate, isolated area, but more as a force of sorts that permeates all life, both online and offline. Is that a fair characterization? Have I got the broad strokes right?
Actually, it's a colleague. He also works and teaches in Zurich, Felix Stalder. And his book in German, it's called Kultur der Digitalität. There is actually an English version of it, which makes maybe more clear what he thinks about. And the title in English is The Digital Condition. And his background is actually digital culture theory, network theory, and he came up with a kind of an analysis of the social, so to say, and the conditions of life in a culture of digitality. And so he picks up on actually three different aspects of the digital dynamics. And the first he calls referentiality, which means that we nowadays all try to, whenever we communicate, we try to refer to something or to somebody. So we ourselves start creating kinds of communicative networks and to kind of create this kind of referentiality. So we are always in a certain kind of correspondence or resonance. The second term he mentions is communality. So what he says by that is that we always try to build up, in our case now of the digital, new forms of communities or communicative smaller groups where people interact, where people, again, react, but also produce and consume via the digital certain informations, messages, beliefs, faiths, and so forth. And the third is what he called, is a little bit complicated, what he calls the arithmeticity, which is, so to say, the underlying logic of all these communicative digital forms that we are bound to, we are influenced by, but we also create algorithms. And these algorithms, together with this kind of longing for communality and with this dynamic of referentiality, they all not only produce a kind of separate world, but they actually shape our culture. That's the main idea behind his talk of the digital condition. And we think that's very interesting in the sense also for the religion, because you could say the same for religious practices. There's always this kind of resonance or a reference. There is communality, and there is always, we would have said in earlier times, you always stick to certain elements of tradition. When you think and when you practice your faith, you never do that just on your own or by yourself. you always refer to what has already been happening. And now Stalder says that due to the digital, we have a new dynamic which influences all kinds of cultural practices. And there we are. So we think this is actually a very interesting kind of a filter or a certain hermeneutic to understand better what is really going on in the field of religious practice, not only in small separate phenomena, but you could actually say the whole idea of religious communication and religious community building changes or transforms due to the digital affordances.
I would like to add on to that and give another glimpse behind the scenes, kind of, because of course this understanding of a culture of digitality is very helpful for our research, but at the same time it poses a challenge for us as researchers because we are part of it. So when we do research and we say that the digital has become an infrastructure of existence, as a consequence, it becomes very difficult to define a clear field of research, considerably more complex than it was in pre-digital contexts, since digital processes are potentially open-ended. And the same as the interconnectedness that Stalder is writing about, it does not only complicate the definition of research fields, but also poses methodological challenges for digital religions research, as capturing and reflecting on these multiple dynamics, overlappings, and it is a very highly complex task. So the whole thing becomes even more complex when algorithms as invisible actors kind of get into the play, which makes it difficult to deal with questions of transparency, objectivity, and traceability of research. And these questions are actually questions of negotiations that are not only happening within society, but also happening in our community as researchers in the URPP, which is really interesting. And these processes of negotiations are clearly visible, I would say, in several of the articles in our volume. And it will be even more interesting to see how they further unfold now in our second phase of the URPP.
Our research is actually something like a moving target, which is the reason for this kind of complex interdisciplinary work, which does not really come to an end by being able to say, now this is the final result. And for us, it's interesting that now really religion in its multifold phenomena is in itself becoming more fluid than it might have been in times of the very clear institutional responsibilities. So, yeah, it makes it challenging for us, but also most interesting to see religion in the digital world as this kind of a moving target.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If religion is everywhere and permeates everything, and digitalization and the digital even more so, and how does one define one's scope and focus one's analysis, I can see how that can be challenging. Another recurring theme in the volume is this shift that the digital seems to engender towards a more of a bottom-up social legitimacy, as evidenced by the rise of religious influencers, which is discussed in Chapter 3 of the book, or changes to governance of monasteries and the like, monastic governance, as discussed in Chapter 4. Thinking of this question of hierarchy in general and religious hierarchy specifically, I know for you the digital includes not just, and the religious includes not just a digital, institutional religious life, but also, as Katerina said earlier on, a much broader understanding of religion. And religious experience, how does the rise of digital religious practice favor more horizontal religious hierarchies?
We can clearly observe a shift in religious hierarchies. And I would say rather than institutional religious authorities, interactions between individual actors and their communities become central to religious practices in the digital. To further explain this, in this context, I find the distinction between religion online and online religion introduced by Christopher Helland, a sociologist of religion, particularly helpful. According to Helland, religion online refers to traditional forms of religious communication that are transferred to digital environments, whereas online religion describes forms of lived religion that emerge within digital spaces themselves. two brief examples, religion online could be church services that are held offline, then recorded and then uploaded to platforms such as YouTube, whereas online religion, by contrast, would refer to religious practices in which believers, lay people, interested participants or influencers, as you already mentioned, create digital religious spaces that are not necessarily tied to established formats or clear offline equivalents. So these practices often engage much more explicitly with the functions and dynamics and logics of the platforms and apps they are using. And that's what makes them interesting for us as researchers. Examples would include theological discussions that can unfold in the comment sections of religious influencers on Instagram, or Jewish memes that are widely circulated on Facebook, or, for example, self-organized Hindu prayer gatherings conducted entirely online and without any priest. So in this sense, online religion is not completely separated from religion online, but it highlights how digital environments do not merely host religious practices, but we look at how they actively shape their form and dynamics and also modes of participation, I would say. And this shift, of course, is illustrated particularly well in several chapters of the volume. For example, in chapter 3, where processes of meaning-making among religious influencers are looked at, and chapter 4 examines monastic organizations and their use of digital media. So for us, it's interesting to see how digital practices reshape long-established hierarchical structures. Chapter 6 would be another example where a similar shift is addressed through the activities of religious influencers, and then with a specific focus on how actually these new forms of religious authority can be studied empirically. And that is, again, my question that I posed before. This is a challenge. So in this case, an answer would be a citizen science research approach that proves especially valuable because it helps to capture these dynamics and it also amplifies the voices that were previously unheard, kind of, and in the digital space can be altered.
So we are in a real paradigmatic shift also in terms of the self-understanding of religious authorities. We see different forms of how they try to keep up their authority. Also depends a lot on the specific religion. We see a very strong form of keeping the authority in the Roman Catholic Church, for example, where they really try now from the Vatican to somehow give a very clear understanding of their own authority in terms of the digital. But we see other formats like the Protestants, they have more difficulties in keeping up their authority in a sense by now having all these influences, having all these different forms and formats with no control any longer on the interpretation of doctrinal content, for example. And that is the most fascinating thing now for us to see how these authorities try to keep up with the dynamics, try to keep up their traditional authority, including the content of this authority. We have several projects which also deal with legal canon law issues. So you see there is a lot of different responsibilities and challenges for church institutions and authorities due to you could always almost say due to this disruptive form of religious practice, which comes along with a lot of creativity, of course, but also with a lot of freedom, which is a real challenge for church institutions and their understanding of their own authority and responsibility.
So to summarize this, I would say there are three main aspects of these dynamics that can be identified. First, I would say, Thomas, you referred to the kind of prosumer logics that enable the rise of religious influencers in social media. Then there's also their networks, of course. Then these digital environments contribute to a democratization of interpretive authority, kind of, which also threatens traditional religious authorities. And the third would maybe be these processes of pluralization that intensifies when users can follow multiple influencers simultaneously, and also a kind of decentralization and diversification of religious meaning making that happens.
That makes a lot of sense. Something Thomas said was interesting, the way he drew that contrast between the Catholic response versus the Protestant response. Is there any evidence of varying degrees of impact of the rise of the digital world on different denominations? Have some religions proven themselves to be more or less adaptable than others?
I might just start with an impression which we did not have explicitly in our research so far, but it's now coming up in the second phase. If you look into the dynamics and developments of the evangelical, especially the right-wing evangelicals, you see that, first of all, they seem to be very successful in keeping their audience, or maybe even enlarging their audience. And secondly, they use strategies which we know from the 19th century already. So they have no problems with using technologies as much as possible. So there's not really a deliberation about whether there is a kind of a legitimate use of AI or whatever, platforms, apps, whatever. It's more like what is of best use for the mission we want to take out to the people. And here I would say that the evangelicals, they are very, very successful. They are highly adaptive. In the sense of dealing with all the technological affordances. So that's an example where we certainly see, with all the problems that come with it, now also connected to the political situation in the US especially, that they've certainly adapted to what is going on, whereas the rather traditional institutions, especially on the Protestant side, they still struggle in finding a good way to not only use digital technologies, but to also adapt in the sense of the communicative logic of using religious communication in the digital world.
Although, in my opinion, this might be the case when looking at the institution, but when looking at individuals, it's really interesting that especially on the Protestant side, we see very active Protestant pastors on social media, whereas on the Catholic side, there's still always this notion of trying to keep the authority. For example, when you look at the Pope, who is on Instagram and has 14 million followers, but the Pope does not follow any other person, and there's never any response to comments or messages. So we see a largely one-directional form of communication in this case, whereas Protestant pastors can be approached, they do answer. There's a kind of shared community happening on their accounts, for example.
That's fascinating. The book provides some equally fascinating data about grieving and mourning processes on the internet, including in chapters 1 and 2. I was recently able to attend the funeral of a family member in person. I was in Europe and the funeral took place in Canada. And I was really grateful to be able to, at the very least, observe the proceedings online. And that allowed me somehow to participate in the collective grieving process with the rest of my family by being able to discuss elements of the service and the eulogy with my family after the event. Is the internet the future of mourning? Is this going to, we even sent flowers through online platforms. It's all really integrated in a very user-friendly way, as advanced online platforms are. Is the internet the future of mourning?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Sending flowers and lighting virtual candles. Well, I would say when looking at chapters 1 and 2 of our volume, I would argue that the internet is not a space for mourning for the future, but it is already a reality that the internet is the space for mourning. Your experience of participating digitally in a funeral is precisely what the concept of culture of digitality means, which we discuss in the book, in which the digital is no longer an isolated domain for social practices, but it is all interconnected. And I would say that those digital mourning practices can be understood as a natural extension of the traditional offline rituals. But of course, the rituals, they point towards each other. So on the one hand, you have virtual candles that you light. On the other hand, you will find QR codes on gravestones so that you can enter like memorial sites online. So both spaces have an impact on each other. When the internet is a space for mourning, it is at the same time a space for community building, for being human, for falling in love, for offending, hating, practicing solidarity. So, of course, grieving will today and in the future also be happening on the internet.
Dr. Schlag, in addition to co-editing the volume with Dr. Yadav, you also co-authored a chapter. It was on interreligious education, and it talked about 2 projects specifically. Could you tell us about them?
Yeah, well, we actually started integrating a project on digital religious education into this first phase of the URPP due to the fact that education has not really been a topic in digital religion research we mentioned that at the beginning, over the last 30 years. There are many reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is probably that the researchers who have been dealing with digital religion did not have an educational background, so they were not really very kind of interested or connected to the topic. So we decided to have a focused project on digital religious education. And within this project, colleague Yasmin Suna and me, we had 2 sub-projects, and one was on adult education. So both projects were on non-formal religious education, so not school context, but parish contexts or contexts of the regional churches. And one was on adult education and the other one was on confirmation work. So that's the educational program for the adolescents. And what we wanted to see, and we very much went into the corona, the COVID situation. We wanted to see how these non-formal educational programs reacted on the situation that there was no encounters possible any longer. And how would the office maybe change? How would these responsible educational people address their target groups, be it adults or be it confirmants? And so we did our empirical research by really looking into the programs or the shifts of the programs, the new forms of programs, and the use of digital tools, also in terms of learning and teaching processes, which materials were developed, and how was all this perceived by their audiences, be it the adults or the adolescents. And so it was interesting for us to see, is there actually this transformational shift also in the field of education when we look at the digital religious practice? We had some interesting insights. So we could see, okay, they've used it quite extensively during the COVID time, but after COVID, most of them stepped back to the, so to say, old normal, left behind many opportunities of technological forms of teaching and learning, which was also an interesting result for us. So the hypothesis, so to say, for us is here also for the second phase of the research, whether education will also adapt to the forms of digital, forms of communication, if you want to say, so that we have possibly also a chance of new forms of theologizing in the digital and due to and through digital formats and tools. So that, again, this kind of participatory form of teaching and learning can be enhanced and empowered by the digital. So we'll have to see. So we made a starting point in the first phase on this educational topic, and we're currently continuing on this by looking into other formats of digital religious education in schools now this time, but also again in non-formal contexts. So it is very exciting to see and look into these possible transformations.
Definitely. It's hard to think about digital religion today without recent headlines of AI chatbots inducing psychosis among their users, including particularly religious psychoses, emotional dependencies, and beliefs that one has been chosen by God for a divine mission. And this seems to be becoming quite a common, a recurring problem with AI online. I know these headlines have come out more recently, and your volume may have been sent to press before this phenomenon came to light. How are these issues reflected in the work of the Digital Religions program, and are there any glimmers of underlying questions in this book?
Well, we do have to admit that in the first phase of the URPP, the AI indeed played a rather marginal role, with one notable exception, which is chapter 13 by Beth Singler, who is a professor of digital religions and who has been conducting research on religion and AI for very long, long before AI became a widespread topic and also those headlines. But as she joined the UIPP midway through the first phase, she didn't have an individual project. So this is still something we are working on, but it has changed now. So in this sense, it can be said that your observation has now been adequately addressed in the second phase of the UIPP, and we'll be able to share results in about 3 years. Researchers in Cluster A on emerging technologies and Cluster C on post-digital religious education, as we just heard, are now explicitly engaging with the challenges, opportunities, and potentials of AI, as well as with broader questions concerning developments of societies and the human condition in the face of AI.
Yeah, as you say there, this volume represents only the first phase of a 12-year research program. Looking forward towards phase 2, as you do, which has already begun. Phase 2 is designated for the period 2025-2028. Why has the research program decided to make conspiracy theories one of the major new thematic clusters of exploration? As an online netizen, you know you're going to get my attention when you talk about conspiracy theories. How do they tie into digital religions?
Yeah, we actually got a lot of reactions and attention on this decision that had been made in actually after the first, 2.5, 3 years of first phase, because we had to structure the second phase rather early, and Sabrina Müller and me, who was at the time the scientific manager beside me in the project, we looked at the outcomes of the first phase so far, and we thought, well, what would be challenging now for continuing in the second phase? And we asked the participating projects at the time, what could you imagine to continue if you were in the second phase? And we had some reactions that went into the direction of the, let's call it the ethical, the political dimension of the field of digital religion. And one of the aspects that came up at the time was actually this movement of the longer, the more religious hate speech, polarization, also according to the separation between different and discrimination of different religious faiths and beliefs. And that became very strong due to many also political incidents at the time already. And so we found it very challenging for us to connect this ethical perspective in the second phase with these conspiracy movements. As you might remember, it also had an impact, or Corona had an impact on conspiracy theories very, very intensely. Right-wing populism came up very strong after COVID, or at the final stages of COVID, and also kind of ignited by the digital opportunities of communication. Right back into many, many families, we had these discussions. You see these discussions about different understandings of whatever vaccination policies and so forth. And so we found it very timely to, of the 4 clusters, we call that now in the second phase, to have one cluster dealing with these conspiracy theories, which has now, of course, started since 2025. And we see already very, very interesting outcomes in terms of perception of especially Muslim traditions, perception of right-wing populism. We are confirmed by first results of the second phase that we've made the right choice to integrate a whole cluster on conspiracy theory, actually.
Yeah, I would say the conspiracy theories are a kind of cross-cutting theme. And because we decided to put an emphasis on them, as we are describing in our last chapter, this is one of them. And especially in regard to 2 aspects, I think conspiracy theories are very important to do more research on. The first are the religious connotations of conspiracy theories. They have a function as substitute religion, kind of. So according to current research, there appears to be a significant link between religiosity, spirituality, and also a kind of conspiracy affinity that requires deeper empirical exploration. And the second is, of course, the role of digital influencers, because influencers are central figures, as we already said, in digital religion, and which was already shown in the chapter 3 and 6. 3 and 6, for example, in our volume, but the same mechanisms they use for meaning making can also be used to spread conspiracy theories.
And will there be a follow-up volume then? I mean, it sounds that this is an ongoing project, and so we may have multiple volumes. And if there is going to be a follow-up volume, what themes are you anticipating will be featured there?
I'm very convinced that we will have a follow-up volume or a volume about the findings or insights of the second phase, definitely. There is, of course, a lot of publications going on, not only in the first, but already also in the second phase. A lot of people are doing their PhDs, like Katharina herself. We have others who do their habilitations. And so, I'm very sure that we will catch up with the next phase and presenting the results of what we found out then in 3 years' time from now on. Also, again, what we do and we will plan to do with our results, which is very important, is that kind of public dissemination of the results. So it's not only, we don't want to only be recognized in the academic world, but a lot of our research has to do with concrete policies, concrete interactions and actions from various institutions and stakeholders, be it in law, be it in politics, the media, the religious organizations. So we see this as a specific, not only a challenge, but also a very important part of the profile of this URPP Digital Religions, to be in very close contact with stakeholders, not only in terms of the participatory science, but also in the sense of delivering our results for hopefully shaping politics, raising awareness in the public about problematic developments regarding the use of religion or religious hate speech. So that is something we are not only aiming at, but we see our own responsibility as academic researchers to contribute to this public awareness.
So stay tuned.
Yes, I wanted to say I will be staying tuned. This has been such a stimulating conversation. I will definitely be looking forward to seeing what comes out of this research project and looking forward to your future volumes. And I wanted to thank both of you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having us.
That was Drs. Thomas Schlag and Katharina Yadav. And this has been another episode of Sustainability Matters. Don't forget, you can also participate in the podcast. Let us know what you think of Sustainability Matters. If you would like us to cover any particular topics in future episodes, or if you have thoughts on digital religion that you would like us to explore, do write to us and let us know. Our email is podcast@brill.com. We would love to hear from you. And if enough of you write to us about digital religion or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we promise to explore it in another episode. Thank you as always for being with us. I am your host, Ramzi Nasser. See you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.